All right, so we have here in verse 1, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down. His disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them. Interesting. Now these days, normally whenever we think of preaching, we think of someone standing up in front of everyone else and everyone else sitting down, right? But back in the ancient times, whenever you were going to teach your disciples, with the exception of reading the Word. Now, whenever the rabbis would read from the Bible directly, they would have the scrolls open. They would stand for a reading of the Word. And we see that Jesus did that when he quoted from Isaiah early in his ministry. But at the other times, it would have looked more like this. This may feel awkward, but this is how it really would have went down. Something more like this, and then all of you would have came and stood around me. Did you guys feel like doing that today? But he would have taught in a comfortable situation like this. And lots of times the disciples would probably stand around him. And as the disciples would begin to stand around him, probably the other people around would slowly start to gather around him as well. So, and Aristotle practiced this. The Greek teachers did this. And the idea is that it somehow would create an even more personal, intense focus on that teacher. And for them, and I think that maybe this is an effect from television. And even sometimes when we go to churches, sometimes we're still looking at a television whenever we're looking at the preacher sometimes. But the idea is that it was this personal activity. And for them, they saw that the act of the teacher and the preacher was a full personal act in which you were to absorb the man himself. And they would gather around him. And I remember one time I was at a church. It was much larger than this. It was a Southern Baptist church down in, I think, Lexington. And it was a really big church. You know, these little towns sometimes can catch you by surprise. They'll have these big churches in them. But the problem was that for about the first 15 rows, there was nobody sitting. And then around row 16, everybody filled the rest of the church all the way to the back. And it was a revival. And my pastor was preaching at that church in a revival. Well, my pastor was so dynamic, and I loved to absorb every word and every expression and everything that just came off his face and his gestures. I was used to sitting either in second or first row, because for those of you who have never sat in second or first row, it's a different experience, isn't it, Norman? You feel the energy of that minister. It's like coming out at you, and it's like it's vivid. It's like watching high-definition television instead of that old 480 definition. So I walked up completely alone to the second pew, and everyone thought that I was part of the ministry team. Oh, I know how it is. I know how it is. Trust me. You know what? It's a blessing from the Lord when you hear babies in your church at all. I'm telling you that right now. And the people thought that I was going to be preaching or something like that just because I sat in front of all these pews. And I asked the preacher afterwards, I said, what's the problem? I said, you cannot tell me that there is not a problem when no one sits within 15 pews of you. And he goes, yeah, we've had some problems in that church. I said, that's a message. That's a resistance. That's not wanting to learn. But what you need to understand, to the Jews and to these disciples, they saw that the teacher's job was to teach and to preach, but your job was to be the learner. It was a job. And they saw this act of getting up and being active, not passive like you're watching television. Because in church, you're not an audience. You're a congregation, right? You're not just an audience to see a big show. You're a part of what's happening. And so what happens is that for them, this was part of worship because they were learning the wisdom of God. And so they were active and they wanted to absorb everything that was going on. And so the idea here is that the disciples would come forward, and it was very personal and engagement. And they wanted to absorb the message right from the man himself.